All right, so what I'm going to do next here is I am not in any way, legally or otherwise, allowed to give a TED Talk, nor am I qualified to. But if we can go ahead, we good? All right, so just to make sure there's no copyright infringement or anything like that, you know, TED Talk, they always say that their idea is worth spreading. Well, we've learned a lot throughout this journey with Teri. I've learned a lot. For those of you who know me, have spent countless hours researching alternative treatment methods and all of these things and ways to make this journey easier and better for us. And as you know, by virtue of the fact that we're sitting here, you know how it played out. But I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to share with you some of the information that I've learned through this journey, so that, heaven forbid, any of you should find yourself on the same or similar journey. You'll be armed with knowledge that it took me about 6 or 7 months to find. And for us, that 6 or 7 months was crucial. So that said, to avoid any copyright infringement, we're going to do a Teri Talk. And we can just, maybe we can, you know, scrub that first TED logo in the beginning if we need to. But so, all right, and I'm going to just preface this by saying, okay, warning, there's going to be a little science content here. The disclaimer is pretty simple. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a medical researcher. Nothing I say is intended to, you know, prevent, treat, or cure any diseases or whatever. But what I am saying is that the information that I want to share with you guys is really about promoting awareness. And so I'm just a husband who spent the better part of the last year trying to find a way to help my wife. And so that said, I want to just share with you quickly what Teri had and what it was. She had something called glioblastoma multiforme, also called GBM. It's the most aggressive of brain tumors. About 3 in 100,000 people are diagnosed with this every year. The average life expectancy from diagnosis for this with treatment is 12 to 15 months. Without treatment, 3 months, which gives you an idea of how aggressive this actually is. Fewer than 3 to 5% of people survive longer than 5 years. And the treatment, the standard of care treatment, which has been around for as long as they've been trying to figure it out, is surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. And as you can tell by the statistics here, it's not very effective. The average age of onset is 64 years old. Teri was in her 50s when she got this. And the cause is unknown. It's basically the worst lottery you could ever win. So there's research that's being done to try to figure this out, besides me at my couch at 4 in the morning for the past year and a half. Immunotherapy, they're trying some new things. They're doing things targeting proteins that are found on the glioma cells. Gliomas are a certain kind of cell in the brain, and there are proteins and protein receptors around that, and they're trying to target ways that through using your immune system and finding ways to engage your immune system, they can target those protein receptors. Your immune system can now recognize the cancer, and then it can eradicate it as we would eradicate anything that our immune system would normally eradicate. So lots of stuff going on there. There's some promising stuff going on at Roswell Park in Buffalo, at the Cleveland Clinic and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in that realm. Virotherapy. So using modified viruses. Now, Duke University is using the polio virus. We think of polio, we think of terrible things, right? So what this is they actually went into the polio virus. They modified it so that you can't get the polio that used to actually physically cripple people. They took a part of the common cold virus and spliced it in there instead of the part that actually gives you polio. And then what happens is they put that into your body. They give you another booster for polio, which most of us got when we were kids anyway. And then what happens is your immune system can recognize polio. So now there are a lot of receptors on these cancer cells that polio likes, and it kind of glues to. And then the idea is that your immune system will say, hey, we've got polio here. We have to kill the polio. But it's cancer cells infected with polio, and so in turn it kills the cancer cells. So that's the thinking. Duke, to my knowledge, has had 2 success stories with that. They happen to be the first 2 people in their phase 1 trial. I have yet to find any more conclusive evidence that they've, you know, really knocked out of the park yet, but that's going on there. They're also using the Zika virus to kind of approach it the same way. For those of you who know, with Zika, it's a brain inflammation and brain thing, and so they're trying to kind of go down that similar path with that as well. The other thing is medicinal cannabis. Now, there's a lot of research that's being done in Israel, a significant amount actually in Israel, as well as in Spain, and there's actually a clinical trial for people with GBMs going on in Australia now. I think it started somewhat recently. And we actually have in our bodies something called the endocannabinoid cannabinoid system. So cannabinoids are this spectrum of all these different cannabinoids that happen that you would find within cannabis. So THC, CBD, which is everywhere now that we hear about, right? Well, there are over 100 cannabinoids. So it turns out that our body makes 2 cannabinoids. We have an endo, meaning within the body, cannabinoid system. And so on our cells, there are little receptors. And when we have immune issues and things like that, those receptors are triggered, and all this stuff happens that is way above my pay grade because I'm not a scientist nor a researcher. But that said, they did identify in 1990 that these cells have 2 receptors, CB1 and CB2. CB1 receptors are mostly in the central nervous system, brain, spinal cord, and that sort of thing. Also in the skin as well, and some other places, but predominantly up here. CB2, other places predominantly. But those receptors are what allow for cannabis to be used medicinally by our bodies, because our bodies are already primed, because we actually have a system that allows for them to do that. We make cannabinoids. It's in mother's milk. It's in us right now. They're anandamide and 2-AG for those who are playing at home. So just a couple of quick notes. The first documented use of medical cannabis was China in 2700 BC. So it's about 5,000 years ago, roughly, right? Later in India, being documented around 2000 BC, ancient Egypt around 1550 BC, and good old Pliny the Elder in ancient Rome around AD 75. So it's been around, and people have been figuring it out and using it for a long time. Now, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but nonetheless, with regard to medical cannabis research, in 1974, and this is one of the things that really kind of spurred me on my journey when I found out about this, and it also kind of angered me a little bit, and I'll tell you why, is that in 1974, the National Institutes of Health co-funded a study at Virginia Commonwealth University they researched 4 cannabinoids, CBD, THC, actually 2 versions of THC, delta 9 and delta 8, for those who want the science part of it, and then CBN, which is another cannabinoid. And what they found is that the research demonstrated that delta 9 THC induced apoptosis. Apoptosis is cell suicide. It's how cells tell themselves it's time to die. All our cells have a little timer in them, and it says it's time to divide, and it also says it's time to die. And what happens is, apparently, in the cancerous cells, that little timer gets turned off. It mutates, and it doesn't work right. So that's why you get the time to grow, and you get your tumors that form because the cells keep growing, but you don't get the time to die, and so they don't die, right? And so that's what seems to happen, is that delta 9 induces apoptosis in certain cancer cells, both in vivo, which is in the body, and in vitro in a dish, right? And they were using mouse models, and they used 3 different models in the mice models, and they used 3 strains, of cancer, and then 2 in vivo, in vitro, in the dishes. What it also demonstrated was that there was no toxicity at relatively high levels of THC to the bodies. So it didn't cause any toxic, effects or anything like that. It made them a little tired. They probably got the munchies, that kind of thing. But the body could take this on and not have a toxic effect, even at really high doses. It also demonstrated no adverse impact to healthy cells. So the interesting thing about that is that the THC, and THC is really the driver of this, it goes in and it impacts cellular function at a mitochondrial level. And what happens is it turns that timer back on for the cells whose timer is deficient, but it doesn't do anything to harm any of the healthy cells. It just says, how you doing? You're doing good, whatever, that kind of thing. So it's kind of amazing that the cytotoxicity of this, it doesn't negatively impact our bodies. And again, because our bodies have an endocannabinoid system, we're primed to be able to use it medicinally. So what the study ended with is it indicated that further research was warranted in this field. This was really the first kind of main study of this. And what they ended with is they said, basically, because THC crosses the blood-brain barrier, which most pharmaceuticals do not, and because it has the impact on cells that it does, it really warrants further research. Now, for my money, that's a pretty clear directive, right? That, hey, look, this is clearly doing something. And on top of that, it was very explicit about the fact that it was way less toxic to the body than the drugs that are available, the chemotherapies and all that stuff. Chemo kills everything in its sight, whereas this is actually discerning in terms of how it impacts things. So it's just something that I learned. And the thing that upset me the most was that it happened in 1974. It was published in the Journal of National Cancer Institute in 1975. And then you or I never heard of it. The research was largely buried. We can follow the train, follow the money, and figure out why that's the case. I'm not going to go into that. That's a whole other, someone else's legitimate TED Talk. But that said, that was done right here in the US with our tax-funded dollars. So I wanted to share with you guys more specifically our experience with what I have as FECO, full extract cannabis oil. That means that you're not using an extract that's just CBD or just THC or one of the cannabinoids, but rather the full spectrum. The conventional thinking with researchers is that it's more impactful, it's more effective if it uses something called the entourage effect, which means that it's utilizing all of the cannabinoids working together. And that's where the research needs to continue to go, because we really need to figure out, every individual has a different biology, even though we're all human beings, right? So the same medicine might work for you, but not for you. And the same thing here. We need to figure out which cannabinoids are working in which amounts for which people and why, and on what kinds of cancers and so forth. So that said, and RSO is Rick Simpson Oil, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But so what we experienced very specifically with Teri using full extract cannabis oil was improved sleep. So the steroid that she was on was ridiculously abusive to her body and to her mind, in that it keeps you awake. It really prevents you from sleeping well. She would sleep on average about 2.5 hours, and then she would be awake again, and she would be ravenously hungry, because that's what the steroid did. And she would also your mind is just going on that. And so, so prior to using cannabis oil for her, she averaged about 2.5 hours of sleep at a time, and then was up, which meant I was up, and then got her some food. She eventually went back to bed, 2.5 hours again, kind of thing. In the evening, and she slept for 5.5 hours straight that night for the first time in 11 months. I think about 11 months. And so, so that was noticeable, and she felt immeasurably better the next day, because our body heals when we sleep. So the other thing is that she had minimal seizure activity. So in mid-January, she had her first seizure. It was a grand mal seizure. She was at home, and that is very scary. And then within a week was when we started that high CBD version of this. And as you can see on the chart here, I'll show you that later, that has to do with her liver function. But what happened was, we had about just over 2 months of her being able to use this. And so mid-January, big seizure. Top of February, little tiny, about 7-second, what they call a focal seizure, kind of where your eyes just kind of glaze off a little bit. Maybe your breathing gets a little constricted momentarily, goes away. No other seizure activity until about mid-April, when she was starting to have chest pains, and we took her to the hospital, and they found that she had pulmonary emboli, blood clots in the lungs, and we went to the hospital, and they said, you can't use this oil. And I said, well, we've been doing that all along, and it's helping her sleep, and it's all this stuff, and she hasn't had any seizures and so forth. And they said, well, the doctors can't verify kind of what it is, and so we can't give it to her. And so within about a week, she had her second grand mal seizure. And the next day, she had 2 more. And the second of those was about 10 minutes of full-body, full-on convulsive grand mal seizure. And I don't know if you've ever seen that, experienced that, but it's horrific, and it's exhausting. And it takes an immeasurable toll on a person. And so what we can kind of glean from that, and again, it's anecdotal, is that within that window of time that she was able to use it, and cannabis has been used for years and years and years for seizure disorders. So it's not that it's not known that this helps, but we can very clearly see in our journey that in that window of time, it absolutely prevented seizures for the most part, with the exception of that one little one. Now, the other thing is that there was no discernible tumor growth. Now, during that time, and it happened that right before she had that seizure, we had that first one at home, she had an MRI. And so it showed, here's what the tumor looked like. And then 2 months later, again, same size. And we verified this with Duke University, with the Brain Tumor Center down there, and they'd called and said, no, yeah, it's stable. And we were like, great, this is good news, right? Because left untreated, this disease can double in size in like a month. So it's highly aggressive in how it grows. So clearly, again, anecdotally, I'm not a scientist, but we saw, and it's verifiable on our MRIs, no growth within that window. And the last thing is the liver enzyme levels. So in 2018, around Thanksgiving, Teri's blood work came back, and her liver enzyme levels were really high. And they said, let's hold off on doing chemotherapy because it processes through your liver. We want to make sure there's no liver damage. And so let's be really mindful of this, and let's hold off on the chemo. So that's like top of December is when we had gone to Duke, and they said, let's hold off on it. So fast forward, they said, let's wait. The numbers will come down. And then mid-January, we'll start this new chemo regimen, and we'll go from there. So mid-January comes along. Her levels have not gone down. They do a liver biopsy. They find no damage of her liver. And then the seizure happens. And so I get her on the oil. And so we spend that first, you can see in the green vertical set, what's kind of hard to see here, but on January 26th of 2019 is when she first did the CBD oil. So for this about 10 days. And then I was able to finally get a hold of something called RSO, which is just an acronym for Rick Simpson Oil. Rick Simpson is a Canadian guy who found a way to distill the oil from cannabis plants down into almost a grease-like consistency. He used it topically for himself, and it actually got rid of a version of skin cancer that he had. He started giving it to other people. They were using it for different cancers, having good benefits. You can look that up online. That's his story. But again, a lot of anecdotal evidence out there to support this. But what you can see very clearly in that blue section to the right is that that's when we transitioned to the high THC oil. And as you can see, specifically in that top number, and I can't tell you what the difference is between ALT and AST, which are the two lines, but very clearly her numbers plummeted. And I should note that when you look at this, and you can't really see it up close, but the date was February 6th of that, when she first started on the THC, the blue section, and by February 4th, and then February 12th, so 8 days. Within 8 days, you can see that it went from 407 to 258. So a significant decrease. So what that tells me is that it's very clear that there's benefit here. But the research isn't being done, not here anyway. And so the reason that's the case is because way back in the day, the government decided that they were going to categorize cannabis as something called a Schedule I drug. And by definition, a Schedule I drug has no medicinal benefit to anybody. They're like a heroin and some other like really heavy-duty stuff are on Schedule I. And it makes it illegal. It makes it illegal to research and to use, medicinally or otherwise. And so there's a big push to now get that taken off of Schedule I so that research can begin to be done. The irony, or the hypocrisy, if you will, of this is that the federal government also happens to have a patent on CBD as a neuroprotectant. So it's at the same time saying, yes, we know there's value to this medicinally, but there's no medicinal value to this, so we're going to keep it illegal. So for me, that's something that I will, in my life, heretofore be advocating where I can for change to. But I wanted to let you guys know that that's the case as well, because it's really hard to get a hold of good full extract cannabis oil, particularly the high THC version. I actually had to learn to make it myself, which there are tutorials, and you can do it. I don't advise it. I mean, but when it's a matter of life and death, what are you going to do, right? So all that to say, what our experience showed certain positives that if more people start to just document as much as they can of their own journey with this, clinically speaking, and we start to share that with the medical community, that's how information gets out, and it starts to turn the tide of understanding, and it begins to destigmatize cannabis, and that's where we start to get to at least have the research done to see how this can benefit us. So I put this out here, again, just to create awareness, because it took me about 6 months before any of this came on my radar. And you know, when you have a medical diagnosis that maybe gives you 14 months, you're already significantly behind the 8 ball. By the time Teri got any of this in her system, it was 11 months into that 14-month window. So I tell you this so that should anybody you know, or heaven forbid you, be on this journey, a journey similar to this, that at the onset you talk with your doctors about it. I want to just point to some anecdotal evidence. There are 4 cases here of people who had brain tumors of one form or the other. Dahlia Barnhart was a young girl. She was about 2 years old when she was diagnosed with a very rare version of a brain tumor. Her mom, Mariah Barnhart, was a huge advocate of cannabis use, and not like recreationally, but medicinally. And she worked with doctors. She actually moved her family to Colorado to be able to do this. Her daughter is now, I believe, 6 or 7 years old. She's a happy, healthy little girl, and she's doing well. Amelia Powers is a woman in the UK, similar tumor version to Teri's, and she's been, you know, she used cannabis oil. Her tumor has since gone away. Lynn Cameron in Scotland, she had exactly what Teri had in the same place, a GBM in the front right lobe. She full extract cannabis oil, within about 3 to 4 months, her tumor was almost unfindable. And Alyssa Irwin is a young woman in the U.S. up in the northern Midwest. She actually, and this is one of the most amazing things, she was about 14 when she was diagnosed, give or take. She went through the standard of care treatment, surgery, chemo, radiation, and then she really started to go downhill, and her family was able to get her some of this oil, and her tumor dissipated. Then, being a teenager, she was about 17 or 18 at the time, she maybe wasn't taking it as regularly, maybe they weren't taking it as often because it is expensive. Her tumor came back, which glioblastoma does. It's the nature of it. It will always come back. And so her family was able to get her more oil, and it went away a second time. So what that tells you, I mean, it's pretty clear, is that there's some value in this. Now, it's not saying that that's going to work for everybody, but how do we know who it is and isn't going to work for unless we're researching it? So, so it's really important. So additional resources I just want to throw to you. Rick Simpson, the guy in Canada who used it topically and learned how to create that oil. He has a whole story about it at phoenixtears.ca. There's also a series of podcasts called cannabishealthradio.com. You can actually find it on YouTube. And there are a lot of people with different cancers who are sharing their stories. And again, it's anecdotal evidence, but until we start to document, you know, people who are actually using this and the specific benefits that they show medicinally, medically, until we do that, we're kind of putting ourselves behind the 8 ball. And I think that we owe to ourselves as a nation to move beyond the stigma that's tied to it, which our allies, Israel, Spain, you know, Australia, are doing, and they're helping people. You know, yeah, as I said earlier, with no medication is guaranteed to help every person the same way, but how do we know until we actually go down that path and really try it? So last but not least, what can you do? You can educate yourself. So this is my start for you, just to create awareness, and I appreciate your patience in letting me talk to you about this. Speak with your medical providers about what you learned. I can tell you that when Teri went to the hospital and they wouldn't let us use that oil, I had conversations with doctors and with 2 handfuls of nurses at any given time saying, well, you know, this is what we're using, and it seemed to be helping. And almost none of them knew anything about the endocannabinoid system. They didn't know anything about the THC research that had been done. They knew nothing. And so I just shared stories that I've shared with you and said to them, you know, go do this, try it, look into it, educate yourself. They're medical professionals. You know, these are people who are earnest, hardworking medical professionals that want to help people, and this is something they know nothing about. You know what I mean? It's a little inconceivable to me. Contact your elected representatives. Encourage them to have cannabis removed as a federal Schedule I drug. It has no business being there, right? So, you know, I will let other people, I'll let other people talk about the recreational legalization. That for me is neither here nor there. It doesn't impact me. But what I will say is that I think that we owe it to ourselves, and we're doing ourselves a tremendous disservice if we don't work to alleviate that Schedule I rating and really get down to the nitty-gritty. I can tell you that when we went to Duke University, and this is not to disparage anyone there, they were great. They, you know, wonderful, hardworking people doing really cutting-edge research. But when I spoke to the head of the program there after I had sent our first MRIs to them, he had to legally tell me in our conversation, I have to tell you that I have a financial interest in the outcomes of our research here. And to me, that instantly created a conflict of interest. And I was like, well, are you here to, and I didn't say this, but my thinking was, are you here to try to cure cancer, or are you here to try to make money off curing cancer? Because I would really like the former than the latter. You know, again, and it's not to disparage them. They're doing what within the system they can do, and that's kind of how things are. But my feeling is that we really owe to ourselves and to the people that we love to really move forward with that kind of research and you know, and get to the point where we're making strides. So that ends my Teri Talk. I appreciate your giving me some patience because, again, if I had known this in the beginning, who knows how that might have positively impacted Teri's life, and maybe we wouldn't be sitting here in this theater celebrating what was her life, but maybe we'd be sitting in the theater listening to her sing and celebrating with her life. And so, anyway, I just wanted to share that with you all. So thank you for that.